Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for Academic Dialogue in Hargeysa Africa 1440 webinar series, where we are covering issues related to COVID. And tonight we are going to have our 11th episode, which we are going to be talking about the impact and how COVID has been impacting the justice system in the continent, and also bring some experiences globally too. And as usual, we have our four panelists who are going to help us to discuss and go through this panel. And our first speaker for the panel tonight is going to be Hargeysa Omar, who is a Somali lawyer and human rights advocate. She is the current director of the Horizon Institute in Somaliland. She is an author of a number of books and reports and articles on genocide, conflict, war, justice, and gender. As she's also one of the first, actually the first human rights researcher who was in the ground during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. And she has authored the book account, which is titled Rwanda, Despair and Defiance. And this is something everybody is using as a basic reference for the events that happened in that time. And she was also, she has worked extensively in different places, including Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other countries in Africa. In 2009, she has served as a member of the African Union higher level panel on Darfur as an advisor to the Joint Special Representative of the United Nations African Union Mission in Darfur. And also in 2013-14, she was a member of the high-level panel of fragile states established by the African Development Bank. And so she is also the co-founder in 2013. The second speaker for the night is going to be Chuma Nkelo, who is a lawyer and a writer who has published several books. And he has worked also briefly on a legal aid council and was managing partner to the CNC chambers. He has convened a lot of legal and literary conferences and was writer resident on the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, and chair of Layers newspaper in Oxford. Chuma has led a lot of creative seminars in Oxford and other universities. And he actually is a member of the Nigerian Bar Association, the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, the Association of Nigerian Authors, and PEN. So this will be experiences that we look forward through the conversation that we are going to have as we are going to have him as a speaker. So these two are going to be our main speakers, joined by our respondent for the night, Zahara Jibril Ahmed, who is a management consultant and also a co-founder of the Horizon Institute. She is a specialist in public service reforms and government. Her work has been instrumental in the development of public services across Somaliland, including reforms in the health and education sector. So she will be the respondent for the night. Unfortunately, we are not able to have our second respondent due to the internet and power problems, but we are gonna have our moderator, Hannah Dawud, who is a young human rights advocate and lawyer with extensive community service and research participation regarding law and order in Somaliland. So these are gonna be the panelists we are gonna have for our 11th episode. And as always, thank you very much everyone who has joined us in the Zoom webinar platform, and those of you who are following us on our Facebook account live streaming the program. So thank you very much, Hannah, and I'll pass it back to you to do your moderation.
Thank you very much, Tersit. Hello, everyone. The pandemic of COVID-19 has threatened human life in every aspect, and it's not accepting the access to justice and legal practices. Our dialogue questions today will cover how has COVID-19 impacted the justice surface in the continent, and also what has been the mechanisms to address the gap during the pandemic. Our third question will be, what is the lessons, if there is any form of the pandemic in relation to justice and human rights? And also we will like to cover what should be done to make sure the pandemic doesn't help to compromise the effective justice delivery. I would like to welcome Dr. Chama Musa Chama to set the scene for our topic today about the impacts of COVID-19 on justice. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and it's really a pleasure to have the continuation of this series, which is becoming a quite important and weighted appointment or meeting. Impact on COVID-19 pandemic on justice. Of course, justice is an essential, if not one of the most vital services and in the crisis, even in the crisis times like this pandemic. I first want to thank the wonderful panelists that we have today. It's always a pleasure and a real honor to have Rakia Omar with us. As you had the presentation by Tirsit, I want to add also someone, Rakia, as a pioneer who fought for justice under the Siad Barre regime. And if the book of the genocide in Rwanda has been referred much, I would dare to say that the government at war against its own people was one of the most referred books when it comes to what was happening in Somaliland under the Siad Barre dictatorship. So I want to really thank that she could join us today. It's a pleasure to have Chuma. I know that there is always some connections in this initial part of the session of the webinar. Chuma is someone who was a permanent at the Hargeysa International Book Fair, and since it's this time of the year when we usually meet, it's a pleasure to have him online. I know that there's a problem in Ethiopia about the weather, so we will not be having Solomon with us. And Sahara and Hannah are, as they used to say, playing at home, so probably they are the ones who are welcoming me, since I am outside of the center today. Having said that, when the machine of the formal justice doesn't work because of the crisis like the pandemic of today, what we have to do? That's a real big question. Of course, justice cannot wait. So whether we are under the lockdown, whether we are in the crisis, justice should be served. And that's the most crucial thing that's taking place in many parts of the world, in particular in our continent. And talking about specifically Somaliland, where we have, I have the experience. Somaliland, for instance, where the citizens is already complaining even before the coronavirus because of the length of the processes of justice, or because of the competing different books of law, would say traditional, formal courts, Islamic Sharia. What we asked today is what additional problem that the coronavirus came with. So it's a really important topic for Somaliland, and I would say timely for worldwide. Well, that's what I wanted to invite our speakers to reflect on, and to see by extension what's going on in the continent. They're focusing on the similarities, but also the differences that's taking place in different parts of the wider continent, African continent. The COVID-19 came suddenly as a pandemic, and it will leave us. We know that we are living in a state of uncertainty, but definitely it will leave us. But it will leave in some sort of signs that are not delayable. So what we would like to focus usually on this kind of conversation is to see post-COVID what will happen. That's also the title of the webinar. What will happen after the coronavirus? We use the new normal, two words that are not even compatible between them, but that's the reality that we have to deal. So what will bring in terms of justice and serving the justice after the coronavirus on the so-called new normal or post-COVID-19? Of course, I will leave these questions and many others that, and the other questions that Hannah has just asked to our speakers. But I wanted to encourage our audience that who are particularly today more numerous than usual because of the topic, which is really, really important. And I want that they reflect on these questions equally like our speakers. And if they have questions, they can ask through Q&A session if they are connected to Zoom. Otherwise, for those who are following us online via Facebook page of the Hargeysa Cultural Center, I invite you to write their questions on the comment side, and the staff of the Hargeysa Cultural Center will pass to Hannah. With that, I wish all of you a good debating and hopefully productive discussion. And I will pass the mic again to Hannah. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chama. There's a popular saying of William Gladstone says that justice delayed is justice denied. So I totally agree with you, and thank you very much for providing such platform. I would like to welcome our first speaker, Raki Omar, to enlighten us about the justice work she's been doing in Somaliland, and also her perspective about the impact of COVID-19 on justice in the continent. Welcome, Rakia.
Thank you very much, Chama and Hannah and Tirsit, for all the kind words that you said. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'd just like to plunge into the discussion. Before we get to discussing Somaliland specifically, I think it's important to underline that this is a universal global problem. And in fact, countries that have had a strict lockdown have been far more affected, whether it is their economy or whether it is their justice sector, than a place like Somaliland, where there really has never been a lockdown. So in countries which have had a serious lockdown, and particularly for a prolonged period, the impact on the justice sector has been much more severe. I mean, on the economy of lawyers. I think the only lawyers that have flourished are divorce lawyers during the lockdown. But I think apart from that, most lawyers have really been, very badly affected. And of course, access to justice with the courts closed has been a huge factor. And I think Africa, most countries, I think with the exception of South Africa, have not had a prolonged and tight lockdown. So the impact has been far less. But even in a place like Somaliland, the first thing that happened with the justice sector is that the civil courts were closed. And of course, already a huge percentage of the population in Somaliland do not have access to courts. So we have to understand that when we talk about the impact, we're not talking about an impact on everyone, because a huge number of people outside the main towns in Somaliland don't have access to justice. So whether there is a pandemic or there isn't a pandemic makes no difference to them. But for those who have had the privilege of having access to justice in Hargeysa, Bur'o, Borama, Berbera, Las Anod, Airigabo, the main towns, the immediate impact, I would say, the most tangible impact of the closure of the civil courts is that it has affected women, in particular, who were seeking divorces, who were seeking financial maintenance after separation or a divorce, or disputes over child custody. So they have not been able to go to court. And this is also an opportunity to make the point that access to courts, the formal justice sector, has been a huge benefit to women. Has been a huge benefit, particularly to women who are the victims of, unfair practices, which is largely most women in Somaliland, particularly those who are, outside the privileged few like ourselves. But even criminal cases have slowed down, and particularly the fact that going to the end of April and going into May, then you also had Ramadan, and then you also had the Eid period, just made the whole slowdown of the justice sector much more pronounced. So, and then obviously the fact that many organizations, legal aid organizations providing legal assistance, be it Horizon and others, had a work from home policy for their staff, like early on. Ours started, for example, on the 18th of March. And from the 18th of March to the May 31, our staff were working from home. They still managed to successfully reach a lot of people who needed our services through hotlines, and by directing them and guiding them on the phone, if their relatives were in detention in police stations or prisons, what to do. And we managed to help a lot of people in this way. But it's not a substitute to being able to be with somebody. I mean, going to the court, going to the police station, being able to comfort people in those very distressing situations, just is also very important. So not having in-person work, I think, was detrimental, particularly for poorer people, because a lot of our clients, we find when we just go to the court, and then the court staff or the police officers who know us will say, oh, this lady needs your help, or this father could do with your support. But when we don't go to the court, when we don't go to the police station, that is already a barrier. Like every other situation where there is a crisis, there's also an opportunity. There are also pressures to be creative, to be innovative, and I think in many ways COVID has presented these challenges to people across the globe in many ways, and not just with regard to justice. Many NGOs around the world have really come up with very creative ways of responding to the need people have for legal advice, legal services. I mean, for us, not being able to go to the prisons to provide legal education, to provide legal services, not being able to go with judges to the prison so they can expedite the process has really been unfortunate, because this was a new innovation that we had begun to actually go with judges to the prison and for them to meet the prisoners and talk to them. So that and then another disadvantage has been the fact that we weren't able to work directly with communities. And for us in particular, this was unfortunate because we had just started a series of town hall meetings, really intended to provide a forum for ordinary people to talk about particularly the problem of rape and sexual violence against children, which is a growing problem and a serious problem in Somaliland. But it's not a problem that ordinary people can talk about in the traditional type of workshop. So we started town hall meetings to record and to give them an opportunity. But of course, these types of community meetings had to stop. So that's also has been a direct impact. But as I said, being able to provide services remotely has also been very helpful. And the other very important emphasis for us was to really lobby the Somaliland government to release as many people as possible from prisons and police stations, because this is the perfect environment for COVID-19 to spread. Not only because those places of detentions are notoriously overcrowded, but also the facilities are very poor. It's not only to protect the prisoners and the detainees, but also the staff who work there, the prison guards and the police officers. They have families. They go home to their families. So, and every day they go at the end of the day. So if they are going to go home every day, the chances of them infecting their loved ones, their relatives, their neighbors, their friends is really great. So we especially spent a lot of effort in the early days lobbying for lobbying for the release of prisoners and detainees to the maximum extent possible. So I think it's the pandemic has been an opportunity to think differently about the justice system, and later on I will come to the takeaways. What have we taken away from the challenges of COVID and on its impact on the justice sector? So I'll give an opportunity to Zahra now, I think, or to Hannah to take the discussion in a different direction.
Thank you very much, Rakia, and thank you for the marvelous work you're doing in Somaliland. We will come back for Zahra, but of course we can imagine the difficulty for the legal system where even filing the case to court must be done in person, along with the overcrowded police stations and prisoners. Before I welcome Zahra, I would like to welcome our second speaker, Joma Nokula, to teach us about the great work of Nigeria Bar Association has done during the COVID-19 and his perspectives of the impact of COVID-19 on justice. Welcome, Joma.
Okay, fine. How are you? It's lovely being on this panel. And it's quite interesting listening to what Raki had to say about, the developments in Somaliland. And in Nigeria, it's basically the same thing. The challenge has been widespread. We have just a little bit under 50,000 confirmed cases so far, probably much more under the radar. So it is a growing problem. We are quite relieved it's not quite as bad as it is elsewhere in the world. But it is still a significant problem, especially because many people do not recognize it as a problem and they continue their lives as usual. But as far as it concerns the justice system, obviously you have the law courts, you have the prisons, you have the lawyers and other intermediaries. The Bar Association itself is a very large bar association, and it's because it is predominantly a self-employed system. In the midst of a country that does not have a welfare system, the simply staying at home for this period of time definitely involves a lot of hardship, particularly for unestablished practitioners who may be out of pocket. So the Bar Association on itself, on its own, has put together, like many other organizations, palliative measures for its members. But this has focused particularly on younger members who are presumed to be obviously less likely or liable to cope. And so payments have been made. As much as 5,000 lawyers have received payments so far, and the payments continue. But beyond that, obviously, as far as it concerns the justice system, like Rekia mentioned, there has been the cases of prisoners. There are people, obviously, they have been sentenced, but getting yourself caught in a plague in the midst of a pandemic is obviously over and above the anticipated punishment when the sentences were levied. So obviously, it has come to a situation where the government has put in place a program to release prisoners. So this is a rolling program. There are criteria that has to be met. Some of them is age, some of them is the severity of the punishment, and some of them is the percentage of the time spent. But yes, this is being done. It's usually under the schedule of the chief judge to handle these releases, and these are being rolled out across the board. Then there's also the issue of isolation. Usually when somebody is sentenced, there is a question of when you introduce, obviously this prison population is presumed to be clean of the virus for those who have been in jail before the time. But it's not a static population. You have warders coming in and out, you have contractors coming in and out, visitors, and obviously new inmates. So particularly for the bigger prisons, there is a system of isolation. So newly sentenced inmates are not mixed in with the regular inmates until an isolation period has been observed. So this is also being done. It's happening in Lagos and in bigger prisons, like I said. obviously smaller prisons may find themselves challenged in that respect. So that is also happening, and but generally the justice system is not just the criminal justice system. There's also obviously the civil courts and all that, and it's right now this is about the time we have an annual vacation, so that gives the system a breathing space to, particularly as the lockdown is being relaxed, to be able to see what comes next. But already, I mean, we've been in this since February, March, April, and already the system has had to rethink the way processes are done. In some courts, there are sessions every other day. You have staggered staff resumptions and registry, and you have more like a walk-to-rule system where things don't move quite as fast. Corporate affairs registry, they have slowed down services. Service time deliveries are reduced, and the same thing happens with the courts itself. And then it comes to the main theater of justice, which is the law courts itself. We have to have a really serious rethink about this, particularly during the lockdown period. And obviously the issue of virtual court sessions, came up. And again, the whole issue, these were things that were not in contemplation when the whole idea of justice was being designed in our constitution. So the main question is, are virtual courts constitutional? Since obviously you're not, there's no face-to-face interaction with, persons and the accused, and for the judge to be able to assess, the persons before the court. And in fact, the whole question is the person present in court when he's sitting in his parlor or in his living room. So these are all constitutional issues that have really not been judged. But the Supreme Court has sat and in principle has observed that there is a presumption of regularity, when there is a virtual court session. Indeed, virtual court sessions have held in Nigeria. In fact, somebody had the first of the sessions, there was actually a death sentence handed out for a murder accused. So these are all developments that have happened and adjustments that have been put in place. It has probably pushed our jurisprudence forward by leaps, which is all a system of coping. But I look forward to hearing what others have to say about these issues as we continue.
Thank you very much, Juma. I think that's a great work, really, to have that. I really like the idea of isolating the detainees. So I think that's something we can definitely learn in Somaliland, especially. I would like to welcome Sahra as the respondent, as well, first respondent, to maybe speak more about what Raki have told us, especially the profiling remotely surface in Somaliland for the people to still have access to legal services. Welcome, Sahra.
Hi, thank you, Hannah. Sorry, just in advance, you might hear some children noises in the background, so I apologize for that. Not much I can do about it though, so we'll persevere. No. I think I'd just like to pick up on a few things. Hargeysa has covered Somaliland's aspect quite well, and Horizon Institute has been doing a lot of work in that sector, in the justice sector. But I just wanted to bring together a few things with regards to Africa as a whole and in Somaliland in particular, and that's probably highlighted by what Chuma has just been explaining, which is, I'm very pleased that Chuma has explained the transition that is possible when you have adequate resources and management that allows you to transition the justice sector in a pandemic or when there's a situation that, that wasn't planned for. Of course, with Somaliland, the resources were already meager and limited and very, very stretched, both the government resources and the resources that NGOs and other organizations are working with. And I think some of the things that I've been seeing, although I haven't seen any concrete data, is that the donors have scrambled to move existing resources around to redirect it to health and to PPEs and other things, which obviously meant whatever resources there were, there's even less of them, in addition to what Raki already explained, which is, staff working from home, and then obviously other INGOs and NGOs, their staff weren't even, traveling and getting into the country. And all of those things have an impact on, how justice is delivered, if it's delivered at all. And when things do go back to normal, the huge backlog in cases, particularly in civil cases in Somaliland and in Djibouti, those are the two countries that I've been following. But it also showed that in a pandemic, with COVID in particular, that the justice sector was seen as expendable compared to the health sector, for example. And that even when there has been emergency budgets allocated, it somehow didn't cover the justice sector. So, and I think with regards to police, because again, that's kind of what I'm working with regards to the police. If they don't have the protective gear, to keep themselves safe, and Raqi was mentioning guards as well, to keep themselves safe and not to spread the virus themselves from prisoners and from dealing with, with cases, then although in Somaliland, again, we haven't had the normal experience of a lockdown or preventative measures being followed, but still the disease is active and it is in the community. So it does mean that we are putting them at a much higher risk than other people. In particular, I think with Somaliland police, my worry has always been that we have an aging population with police officers. A lot of our more experienced police officers are, of the higher risk category. So I found myself worrying about that a lot more than sort of other issues. Again, we haven't had the experience of, doing cases online or lawyers able to provide support online because of the, the know-how, the literacy and the lack of IT skills. So I think all those things are problems that are specific, not to Somaliland, but to kind of developing countries. I'm in the UK at the moment, and again, there's been huge issues here with regards to justice and the delays to the justice sector in the criminal and the civil cases. And there's been lots of warnings about the backlog of cases in the criminal courts, the impact that has on victims, but also a lot of the victim support systems that existed, whether it's for domestic violence, whether it's for rape cases. So if that's happening in the UK, we can imagine how that's exacerbated in a country that doesn't have much resources or recognition or budgets or so on. In Djibouti, I've known of private big companies using the COVID situation as a kind of as a loophole to kind of make it an obstacle for smaller companies or individuals that they're in a dispute with. So a case that should have taken 3 months is taking anything, up to already going on to 6 to 9 months now, and could potentially go until the end of the year, which makes it difficult for, companies and individuals with small resources to sustain that. I think that's pretty much all I can pick up on from conversations of the two speakers. I'm sorry, I probably missed a lot, but that's pretty much all I remember.
Thank you very much, Sahar. I think you covered a lot. I think it will be a good time that we can say Somaliland or maybe African continent in large can introduce the legal tech. Maybe I think that's one of the recommendations that we should consider, because like the number of the cases that people wanted to call for the courts, and then the courts about the criminal and urgent cases should always have that space that we can say, okay, this needs to be solved. So thank you very much. Before we go for the question and answer session, I would like to ask Juma to go more about what should be done to make sure the pandemic doesn't help to compromise the effective justice delivery.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I said, what should be done to make sure the pandemic doesn't help to compromise the effective justice delivery? You've told us more about how Nigeria Bar Association was doing a great work in Nigeria, and of course, we would like to hear more about what would you say that this in other countries it doesn't have to repeat, maybe to learn lessons from how Nigeria was handling the COVID-19, and of course the role of lawyers of how to protect the justice. So what would you say that we can learn from the COVID-19 justice? What would you tell for the justice sectors to do in case there is something like COVID-19 come back? God
yes,
forbid.
I think, yes, I got the question now. The thing about it for me is the pandemic has really crystallized the problems in the justice sector before the pandemic.
Exactly.
And this is, this is just the point that prior to the pandemic, the justice sector had some real serious challenges. There were issues of, extremely long trial times. Now, how much more during a pandemic when you cannot sit? So it basically highlights the crisis in the justice sector prior to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, you had situations where the law enforcement agencies were actually at the head of impunity. We had court invasions by the Department of State Security in the court system prior to the epidemic. So a situation where the oppressed had access to the courts and court orders were not being obeyed or were obeyed in the breach. And then now you do not even have access to the court systems at all, or you have extremely limited access to the court systems. So the point is that we really do have a crisis that predated the pandemic, which has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think what the takeaway really is that the essential work of freedom, justice, is a work of fundamental courage. And whatever the implements that are available or not available, it is our challenge as actors in the justice system, whether formally or informally. It's our challenge to bravely take on the odds, anyhow, with whatever tools are at our disposal. One of the criteria that have been used in freeing people are those, for instance, whose terms are almost completed, those who are very old, who are likely terminally ill, or who are extremely ill. So these are all elements of justice, which prior to the pandemic should have been a basis to release convicts. And I think we should take advantage of the pandemic to be more critical about our justice system. It did not require a pandemic for us to know that it is unjust to have people who are terminally ill in prison under extremely bad conditions, to have people who are awaiting trial for years in prison awaiting trial. Sometimes they've been in trial longer than the maximum sentence that they would have got prior if they were convicted. So these did not require a pandemic to tell us we need to empty out our prison cells of people who did not belong there. So these are all challenges. So my takeaway is that the pandemic simply brings to the fore. It does not require a pandemic to ask us to be more original and to be more intelligent about how we deliver justice. Now it has happened and we're thinking virtual court sessions as a means to speeding things up. So our challenge really post-COVID is to continue with that same courage in introducing innovations and also in calling out injustice.
Thank you very much, Joma. I would also like to ask a question for Rakia to give us what would have been the takeaway. You're a human rights advocate, and I know you've been working on a lot of more things. So what do you think is the takeaway for our topic today?
Well, I completely agree with Chuma in saying that the pandemic simply crystallized the problems. It did not create any new problems in the justice sector. He's absolutely right. Why do we need a pandemic to tell us that somebody who is clearly mentally unfit should not be in prison, or somebody who is extremely old should not be in prison? That is just inhumane. But for me, a very important takeaway from, which is particularly relevant to Somaliland, is the absence of community radios. the complete domination of news and information in Somaliland by Radio Hargeysa has now been shown to be completely untenable. Almost every country in the world has used community radios, has used radios in addition to other forms of communication to educate their people. And what is important is not simply that radio is a medium for providing information, it's also a critically important medium for fighting disinformation. I mean, right now in Somaliland, everyone believes that the pandemic has finished. There is no more pandemic. You have children on the streets, when they see the odd person wearing a mask, they shout, but why? The pandemic is over. I mean, it is, you know, you have, large scale prayers banned in Mecca and Medina, but it's happening in all the mosques in Somaliland. The complete refusal of successive Somaliland governments to allow community radios, really now is the time to challenge that, because radio is the best way, particularly to reach the most poor, the most vulnerable, and the most isolated. So I really hope that this is going to be an opportunity for us to include access to information and the ability to fight disinformation, because fighting disinformation in the context of the pandemic is a matter of life and death. It's not a luxury. It's not a privilege to hear different forms of opinions. We are talking about telling people that they, nurses and doctors should be wearing masks, and being able to, inform people that when they go to even a rural health clinic, that this is something they should expect, or that, just basic information about what to do and what not to do, or what the new rules and regulations are. The fact that people can't get it unless they tune into Radio Hargeysa only, I think for me that is just really one of the most critical takeaways. But apart from that, I mean, right now in Somaliland, everything is back to normal, but everything is like pre-pandemic. Therefore, there is no excuse for the justice sector not to work, at least as well as it was working before, but that was not good enough. As Chuma said, what we have seen during the pandemic is what we should never have seen prior to the pandemic. So it's our responsibility now to say, why are prisons so overcrowded? Why are people whose sentence has finished remaining in prison simply because they're unable to repay a fine of $100? I mean, there are people who are remaining in prison whose sentence has finished, who are spending more time simply because they cannot pay a civil fine longer than the sentence that put them in prison in the first place. That is not only inhumane and unjust, it is also impractical. You are overcrowding the prisons for really no justifiable reason whatsoever. And at the moment, for example, Horizon is doing a lot, is focusing on the children in prison. I mean, we have so many young men in Somaliland in prison for stealing a Nokia. People who are children of 15, 16, 17, who are being imprisoned for 2 to 3 years, accused, the prosecution tends to, as thinking that they are discouraging this theft. Instead of just simple theft, they are accused and sentenced for robbery. Really, 2-3 years for stealing an old Nokia? It makes no sense. And particularly no sense in the context of COVID-19. So we need to look at why our prisons are overcrowded, why our police stations are overcrowded. And we need to ask those questions so that pandemic or no pandemic, post-pandemic or whatever, we are providing solutions to our problems in a way that serves the interests of the largest number of our people.
Thank you very much, Rakia. I think we will have a lot of takeaways that we will work on, and of course, as our role model, I think we will always take a consultation from you. We will go for the question and answer session. We have a first question which from Abdurrahman Muse. He says, what are the lasting impacts, if there are, that you think will hamper the working system of the judiciary after the pandemic? This question is for everyone, but I will pass to Juma.
Yes, I've already mentioned the virtual course. I think it's very significant. It will be finessed, it will be improved, it will be tweaked, and I think it's going to be a very important extension of the justice system. We're also looking at the fact that you can't go to court, so that improves the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, particularly in the community. Before the courts came, we had systems of resolving justice. So they have been more patronized this system, to my personal knowledge. I think we should see more of that on board. And then also I see that there was a question which is probably still hanging there about what other justice actors, apart from the legal system, are doing. And I can also touch on it here tangentially. And this is the fact that advocacy remains a very important part of delivering justice. When things happen, the court system is usually the slowest way of getting justice. But particularly when you are dealing with politicians and state actors, public advocacy is a very important means of getting immediate political recourse. So which means that for people to get more engaged in justice, justice is not something a society delegates to the court and the judge and all that. It is something that people should actively participate in if they want a just society. So when there's a blatant case of injustice, people need to step up, people need to speak up. If you see somebody being raped in your presence, it is your personal duty to intervene. Don't wait for the police or the courts. If you see something happening in your presence that is wrong, you should raise your voice and protest. So I think that's a very important takeaway, not being able to go to the courts and understanding that in a community, justice is a communal responsibility and people need to step up to the plate.
Thank you very much, Juma. Rakia, what do you think will hamper the working system of judiciary after the pandemic? I'll pass the question to you too. What do you think?
Well, I think the problems the judiciary had before the pandemic persist, and sadly, I think they will persist. I don't think in the context, particularly of Somaliland, that there were unique problems created exclusively by the pandemic. I mean, it was just literally, those few weeks when the civil courts were closed. But the problems of the justice sector, particularly for ordinary people, we really have to emphasize that access to justice for a wealthy person in Hargeysa is a very, very different question for somebody in Odweyne or in Ainabo or many other rural places where there are simply not even the courts. Never mind being able to afford the transport, being able to afford all the other expenses which are related with justice. So I think the problems of the most important problems the justice sector faced prior to the pandemic are exactly what we are facing now. I just really hope sincerely that people have taken the opportunity to reflect on what those problems were and will be more engaged in addressing them in future. And I couldn't agree more with Chuma that justice is not a matter of what is out there in the courts and the formal justice sector. And by that, I don't mean that we rush to the elders. What I mean is that we need to see, as Chuma said, we need to see that getting justice for people who don't have it is the responsibility of each and every one of us. It's not something you can simply delegate to people who work formally in the justice sector. And, for example, many of the cases we take on come to us informally from people who work in the justice sector, but who find it impossible to push those cases through the institutions where they work. So I take my hat off to a lot of police officers, court registrars, etc., who care, but who often don't have the means to do anything about the injustices they see every day in front of them.
Thank you very much, Rakia. Sahra, would you please add something?
I think on Somaliland's case, Raghia has covered it very well, and it's often very frustrating because year in, year out, we're essentially saying the same thing, that we need to make the courts more accessible, we need to push the courts beyond Hargeysa, we need to address the rural courts. And one thing that popped into my head when Rakia was speaking now was, I know the issue of the mobile courts was started at some point, but I guess now with the pandemic, it probably resources reallocated, they're not doing them anymore. They weren't doing them very often in the first place for it to make a big real difference. But at least if they get around twice a year or 3 times a year, some cases were being dealt with, and there were some visits that were being carried out in the regions. But I still, both with the police and the justice sector in Somaliland, I just feel like we're moving at a pace of a tortoise. Turtle or tortoise? The one that lives on land. I can't remember. I just feel like we're just saying the same thing year in, year out, that even in Hargeysa, you know, you've got to have the connections and the wealth to, you know, to not only get your cases in the court, but then to get it moving. Even when you know, you've got to go there on a daily basis and make it a full-time job. And I think those obstacles need to be removed, whether there's a pandemic or whether there's not a pandemic. And I'm a bit worried that other things become a priority, and COVID and the pandemic and sort of all that forces it, you know, to become less of a priority. That's my worry post-pandemic, that after the pandemic, other things like, which should be prioritized, you know, more of a priority, and that we stay in the same in the same situation that we've been, or even go backwards and, you know, get the elders involved and allocate some cases to them, and maybe try and create, I mean, I know Chuma, some people might understand what Chuma has been saying as kind of informal solving cases, but particularly when it comes to criminal cases, I totally do not feel like that. And I think basically because most of my experience is based on rape cases in the regions, I think it's a disservice, and it doesn't do the victims any justice, and it doesn't do the communities any justice. So we have in all of our advocacies been trying to make sure that criminal cases go through the criminal procedures, but it makes it so difficult when people can't physically get to the systems and the institutions that they need to get the cases heard. So I think that's pretty much our collective anxieties and worries.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Juma?
Yes, let me comment very briefly. To point out, when I said people should not wait for the court, I said if a rape is happening in your presence, you don't wait for the police to intervene, you stop it, you take action. And that's what I mean when I say we don't delegate justice. So yes, definitely, cases, important matters like rape is not supposed to be sorted out privately. I totally agree with that. I also wanted to add that there is something about a class difference in our justice system right across Africa. Like Rakia pointed out, in Nigeria, there are many cases, still one mobile phone, go to jail for 1 year. Still ₦1 billion, you pay maybe 100,000 naira. So there's a discount there that goes completely against the whole idea of justice. And I hope that we begin to tackle them, you know, now. I just wanted to jump in and make that point.
Thank you very much, Jama. I would like to also loop in Dr. Jama. If you can please give us an...
Yes, I think if the pandemic have affected one thing will be, and it's be in public spaces. I completely agree with Rakia that the problem and Chuma, the problem that we had, we will continue having. So we have to focus on what we have more than anything new that you know, came with coronavirus. But something good that was happening recently was the work that, for example, Horizon Studio is doing as a public debate, whether it's the universities and other places where people were coming together and discussing about real issues that has to do with the justice and community development. I'm afraid that with the excuse that we cannot come together, we will be selective on this. I mean that many important things that we really need is physical public spaces to be opened. Not we are doing now because of the coronavirus or because of we will delay or someone will not allow, if you want, or at least promote. So my will is that we restart because of that was really crucial activities that we have seen, the impact that it had, whether it's gender-based violence or whether it's violence against children or whether it's all those things that really in Somaliland and in Somali society we tried to put under the net and not ever discuss it. That was coming up with these kind of public debates and community discussions. So I want to emphasize if there is anything new with the coronavirus, is the excuse that the public spaces will be shrinking. So we have to fight against that and allow that the public spaces, physical public spaces meetings should come back. Of course, within the limit of of the health-wise situation, but talking about post-coronavirus, as the question was saying.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jama. The second question is from Facebook. It's Ahmed Umar. He said, learning a lot from Rakia, is there an opportunity to provide legal service through Zoom? If COVID-19 winter wave comes, do you think the virtual court is possible? Rakia?
I think, certainly legal advice and information though can be provided via Zoom. I am myself new to Zoom, so I'm probably the last person to ask, but many of my colleagues are much more techno savvy. But I think, it is our responsibility to be as responsive and as creative as possible. So, as I said, between 18th of March till the 31st of May, Horizon's paralegals were providing on a daily basis, extensive legal services, be it advice or be it just the information or what to do about a specific case, or even taking on new cases on the, on hotline. So there's also no reason why it cannot be done through the internet. Of course, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this again is something that is of course going to be accessible to people who can afford those services. So we must always keep that in mind. But people who can afford those services also need them. So if there is a way to get it to them, that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, that's great. Joma, I would like to ask you a follow-up to that question too. I think it would be great to have a legal education through Zoom. You've been a member of Nigerian Bar Association. So were there any ideas around or initiatives around a legal education through Zoom where you can, where we can educate people about their legal rights or constitution, so whatever? What do you think? Joma?
We can't hear you.
Sorry, can you say that again? I got a call that distracted me.
Yeah, it's okay. Joma was Ahmed Umar from the Facebook asked us, is there an opportunity to provide legal service through Zoom? And from that question, Raki have answered that question. And as a follow-up, I wanted to ask you, were there opportunity where Nigeria Bar Association created a legal education through Zoom, a webinar or a workshop that you guys planned?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, this is one of the spin-offs that has been very good. As benefits of the COVID, if I put it that way. We have a a standard requirement that lawyers continue their education. And this has always proved a challenge because they used to have to be physical conferences. Now COVID has made it essential that all training go virtual. And this has had a knock-on effect both on attendance and on numbers. For instance, our election, which happened, the national elections to the Bar Executive happened a few weeks ago, and it has been the absolutely best attended election on record. And the next, we also have in a couple of weeks, we are having the National Convention, the annual convention, which is the biggest, it's rated as the biggest in the world. And again, it is likely to be the best attended, it's going to be virtual. So yes, on a daily basis, we have notifications for conferences, both unofficial and official, or for continuing legal education. But this is as it concerns lawyers. Where we now have to extend the program is to actually begin to extend legal education as to your rights and as to the alternatives for relief into the community. And it's also important not only to train citizens about their rights, it's also important to train both civil servants and agents of government about the limitations to their rights. This is of critical importance because we have a lot of abuse of state powers, both from policemen, from people who actually exercise state powers, who are actually private servants instead of public servants because of the use to which they put state powers. So for these people, we need to target the delivery of legal training as to the limitations of these powers that they exercise.
Thank you very much, Joma. The next question is for Rakia. Ahmed Yassin from Facebook asked us, we have seen a police brutality and related human rights challenge in some places in Africa. How do you see that?
In the context of COVID?
Apparently that's what he meant, but he never mentioned COVID-19.
Well, I mean, you know, obviously, human rights violations in Africa is not going to come as a surprise to anyone, you know, and I think in the context of the pandemic, for example, there have been, you know, concerns, for example, in Kenya about police brutality, about the police using the curfew as an opportunity, you know, as even more opportunity for corruption. And there have been, I mean, in fact, I think it was, there were cases of police brutality and deaths at the hands of the police here, I mean in Kenya, at the same time as the obviously very famous George Floyd case in the US. And a lot of people were asking, well, you know, why isn't the same reaction and attention being paid to these cases? There have been also concerns about the police in, you know, other African countries. So I mean, as citizens of Africa, as you know, particularly privileged people who have, you know, been given the education and the opportunity to do something about it. I mean, I can only repeat what Chuma already said, which is each one of us has an ongoing responsibility to do whatever it is that we can to not only report in whatever is the most effective format these violations, but also to concretely address them if you can and if you have the opportunity. And a lot of you know, people who are concerned, who don't necessarily live inside the country itself, can also do something, particularly because most African governments are now more terrified of social media than they are of anything else. So, hey, you have a platform. You know, make sure you have the right information. You make sure you are informed and targeted in your concern. Don't make it personal. Don't make it political. If you are genuinely concerned about human rights violations, today you have the information at your fingertips. So the information is power. Information is ammunition. So use it in an intelligent, targeted way that helps the people who need your help.
Thank you very much. Again, another question for you, Rakia, and it's from Mustafa Ahmed. He said, what's your perspective regarding the COVID-19 and human rights abuses? Is there any tangible link between the two?
Well, I think in the context of Somaliland and the work we do, we have not come across real hard evidence that there has been dramatic increase in human rights violations because of the COVID. I think with the exception that because of the COVID, keeping people in overcrowded police stations and prisons becomes potentially a death sentence for some people. So there is even more responsibility to do whatever is humanly possible to depopulate the prisons and police stations because of COVID. So I think with the exception of police stations and prisons, I would say the human rights issues that are very concerning in Somaliland, for example, the behavior of the police. Was a factor, as Zahra said, year in and year out. We say the same thing. I mean, we really do sound like broken records on so many issues. Nothing is done. So that the question is, why isn't something being done? And could COVID-19 now provide an impetus to get real change happening?
Okay. Thank you very much, Rakia. This question for Juma. Asma Mohammed from the Facebook said, other than the courts, who has been the human rights and related issue? Other than the courts, how has been the human rights and related issue been handled in Nigeria?
Human rights issues, I've referred to it briefly. It's an ongoing thing. The crisis was there before the courts. And right now, for instance, the Bar Association has an invitee, who is the governor of Kaduna State, which has been infamous in the last few years for massacres of villagers by armed bandits and jihadists who have been operating without restraint. And obviously, this has been going on for several years. And around his invitation, there has been a lot of advocacy, both against the advocate and against the attendants, and also highlighting the need to confront those issues. So a lot is going on in the field of advocacy as a means of redressing issues that are mostly political. A lot of cases where even before the pandemic, judgments have been given against state governments. These are rarely observed. We have cases where judgments have been given against the federal government, against state governments, and which have been observed in the breach. These are issues that have not been affected by the pandemic. They still continue to be the case. And these are issues that are political in the sense that when the citizens rise up and protest and advocate, then politicians will begin to pay attention. But so long as it is left for lawyers and judges, the judge sits down somewhere, makes a pronouncement, the government should release citizen X, and then the government should release prisoner X, court order, and then the court just shrugs it, the government shrugs it off and does nothing. If it is only the business of the lawyers, of the detainee's lawyer and the judge, of course it can be ignored. But if people consider it an offense against the state and protest, then politicians will sit up and pay attention, because they only respond to people pressure, whether at the polls or in protests. So it doesn't have to be a political protest, but it does have to be people being conscious that they are justice, they are the conscience of the country, and it is not something that is delegated to a lawyer. A lawyer can go and get judgment, but it is the state that executes the judgment through the bailiff system. And if the state has decided they will not levy execution against themselves, even when they are wrong, then there is no justice in the country. So this is simply an appeal that it continued. It started prior to the pandemic. It continues and it ends when people begin to take an active position against it.
Thank you very much, Joma. Again, we have a question for everyone this time. It's Abdelkader, and he sent us through email. He said, is there any positive impact that COVID-19 brought on the justice system in Africa? I'll pass first to Rakia.
That's a difficult one. Well, I mean, nothing has been positive about COVID, in whether it's justice or anything else. But I think if it has done anything, I mean, I think at the particularly national, communal level, I think it is what Juma said earlier. It has crystallized. It has really, highlighted what is important. I think even for us as individuals in our personal lives, COVID has done that. It has, we've all been able to, get rid of habits or things we were doing, which we felt were important, but you realize, when you have to make choices, actually they were not. So I think in that sense, it has, COVID has again, just really forced us to concentrate what is important. So if I look at Somaliland, for example, in the context of COVID, for me, it has really shown how deeply we must be concerned about the normal, everyday tendency to overpopulate our prisons and police stations. That was a fact before the pandemic. And what it has done is to show when you are faced with this life-threatening crises, why are our detention places still so unnecessarily full, still having people, like Chuma said, who should not be there? They have terminal illnesses, they're mentally unstable, they're pregnant women, they are children accused of the most petty crimes. Why were they in the first place in prison? Why were they in the first place arrested by the police? So I think if there is a silver lining, it is really to just, peel the layers of the onion and really get to the core, which is to say, which are the problems that we actually can do something about, and we should be addressing. So I think, as in our personal lives, it has just really put the spotlight on what matters and what are the issues which actually are very easy to resolve.
Okay. Thank you, Rakia. I'll pass to Joma.
Yeah, if I can comment briefly on that subject. Yes, I think if there's any silver lining in the COVID, it's the fact that it levels the classes in the justice system. I think the most important justice in the world is really social justice. It's more important than the justice we get in court. The reason why most people steal is because they are hungry. Now, the minority of people who steal because they are billionaires looking for more billions is actually very limited. And the prison population is 99% consists of the lower classes who steal a bag of rice, 20,000 naira, who steal peanuts. And then they get 20 years, 30 years for stealing a bicycle. There were people who have lost their hands because they stole a goat. And there are other people who have stolen billions and not gotten any punishment. So the COVID has come in, and people who had private jets and hospitals all over the world, who have access to the best hospitals over the world, died in Nigeria because they couldn't access their private jets. There was a lockdown, they couldn't go to any good hospital. And they died in the hospitals that they failed to pay attention to. So if there's any silver lining, it is the fact that if they have any sense at all, those who have power, they will understand the need to create social justice after the pandemic. They need to have hospitals where they are. They need to have education where they are to teach people. So that if you have a heart attack in your village, the local primary health center is staffed with doctors who are not in Britain or America. So if we begin to bring about social justice, even if for selfish reasons, then that would have been a positive from the pandemic. So I'd like us to focus more on social justice, economic justice, not just justice in the law courts. The law court justice is important, but the one in the social justice is even more important. And when we talk about security, security is not just policemen and soldiers carrying guns. If you have economic security, people who are confident that they have resources to feed themselves and their family, there will be less insecurity on the streets.
Okay, thank you very much. Sahra?
I think the only thing I can add to that is the one positive thing we can say about COVID is it definitely started a discussion on what is important, like we're having today. What are the priorities, and magnifying what our problem is, like Chuma said. I think in Somaliland's case, we probably do have a disparity, a very big disparity between the haves and the have-nots. But when COVID happened, we all ended up living in the same environment. And then the other thing I was going to say, so it generates that discussion that for everybody and makes it a priority for everybody, the rich and the poor, that essentially is where you call home, that needs to have the facilities. And we had a situation in one of the Horn of Africa countries where there was only 2 ventilators, and one of them was taken to the presidency office, and it generated a whole embarrassment on social media of when is the president going to give back the second ventilator. So to avoid things like that, I presume most governments are going to put in some work to at least make sure that the basics are available in the public health facilities, if for no other reason to stay alive and to avoid the kind of embarrassments that we've been seeing, whereby social media is very, very powerful, where people are literally shaming their leaders and their wealthy people for the situation that we find ourselves in, and for pouring millions and billions into European countries that when they needed they couldn't access. So I think that's probably a very big positive thing in terms of, for us at least.
Thank you very much, Sahra. Our last question is from Mohammed Ahmed. He said, the system is so weak and we don't have resources, as Joma mentioned. So what are the suggestions to fix them? I will first go to Joma. Again, we go back to, recommendations.
Yeah, we're back at recommendations. I think we actually do have enormous resources. We have enormous resources. They're only diverted. Those resources are diverted. There is an opportunity cost for every billion naira that is stolen. And that opportunity cost are the people who have been trained with that money. And so when we talk about hospitals, for instance, if you simply use a billion naira to send the top 1,000 civil servants abroad for treatment, you have deprived the 100,000 people that a hospital could have catered for. So we do have resources. I do not believe, I think Africa is really, in terms of resources, it has always been the richest continent. And all we need to do is simply better management. So our challenge is, I never subscribe to that thing about our poverty. It's not a poor continent, it's just a mismanaged continent. So I would say that we need to focus simply on getting the right leaders, and then not just the right leaders, but the right systems for the leaders, which is always why I talk about the bribe code, which is all about getting the system in place that force the leaders to respect the oaths of office that they have taken.
Thank you very much, Joma. Rakia?
Well, I think it's very important to focus on the fact that so many things that can be done to improve the justice system and the general security, meaning the police as well, whether it is in Somaliland or any other African country, do not require more resources than are already available. You need accountability. without accountability, you cannot improve your justice system or your police force with more money, with more useless training, with more inappropriate workshops. You need to hold people accountable. You're already paying them. Maybe you're not, I mean, we all know they're not being paid very well, but they are being paid. But they're not being supervised. They're not being held accountable. And that's what destroys institutions. How on earth can you have, in your face, open bribery at the police station and expect to build a meaningful justice system? How can you have government officials who are simply absent? They go away when they want, for however long they want. People's court cases are prolonged just because so-and-so has gone to a funeral, so-and-so has a daughter is getting married. What on earth has that got to do with his job description? But people do that because no one is going to hold them accountable. Accountability does not cost money. Accountability is about responsibility. It is about caring that you implement what you have undertaken to do. And it is about supervising people to ensure that they do the job they are supposed to do. If people know that they will be held accountable, that there will be consequences, they will not do, the majority of actions and inactions that cause so much harm and distress and delay and problems for people who are seeking redress in the justice sector. So let's not talk about resources. Let's talk about responsibility and accountability.
Thank you very much. Because of the time, we will go first with, I think this is a very good discussion, and I hope Dr. Sharma can give us more platform like this. I'm so happy that I've joined this session. I will give the last, we'll be concluding, and before that I would like to have a final round for the speakers, and if Joma can go first. Joma?
My final encouragement is simply for all of us to understand that justice is what we accept. If a couple of days ago, somebody told me how she was on the streets and she heard about a hawker. She saw a hawker who had been raped and who had been beaten by her parents for being raped. She was about 13 years old, and who immediately took it on herself to go to the police station because the parents did not do it, because the child was in distress. And she made sure, it took 2 days to get, she went to several hospitals, they refused to see her. And after about 2 days, finally, the girl was attended to, and the rapist was picked up by the police. So I can see a situation where people are becoming more conscious that justice is what we insist on, it's what we accept, and it's what we implement. It's not something, even when there is a justice system as courts and police and all that, it takes the citizen to kick these institutions into work, to work for us. And when the standard is too low for us, it's only us who can say, I will not accept this. I will push it to better accountability. Like Rekia said, issue of accountability, it is us who determines what is acceptable, whether the service our servants give us is acceptable. So I encourage everybody to accept that justice is a personal thing. What do you accept in your environment? What is acceptable to you? That's what you will get. And if you refuse to accept it, you push for a higher standard. Don't be afraid. It's time for braveness, and we should call ourselves and our people to higher standards. Thank you so much for for holding this panel. It's been lovely speaking and listening.
Thank you very much, Joma. Rakia.
I think I would just reiterate really what Juma said. First of all, to really express my appreciation for this opportunity. I think it has been a wonderful discussion. I hope it will just be the first of many. Jama, that's to you. I think there are no solutions that come in silence. Solutions come when people put their heads together, when they engage with each other, when they listen, and they also offer to do whatever they can. So I think the point that Juma made, that we get the justice we deserve, is absolutely true, just like we get the leaders we deserve. And, you know, those of us who are privileged tend to complain only when we have a personal problem, and then we come across the system that ordinary people come across all the time, be it the abusive police officer or the corrupt official in the justice sector. But this is what ordinary people, if they ever actually have access to those institutions, face. We talk a lot about human rights, but I think there is also responsibility. And one of the most important responsibility is just is on us to make sure people know that they actually have their rights. I mean, most of the people that we come across in our work in Somaliland aren't even aware that Somaliland has actually a lot of laws, including the Constitution, that provide a lot of protection, that provide, the laws can always be improved. But if we only implemented the laws as they are, the human rights and justice and rule of law situation would be very different, whether it's Somaliland or many other African countries. So I mean, I did a lot of reflection, you know, at the time that the George Floyd crisis and was happening in America. And you know, it was really a powerful and poignant illustration of what happens when people take the responsibility to be citizens into their own hands. It doesn't have to always be so, you know, violent or so political, as Chuma said, but it is there. You know, we Africans, we Black people looked upon the George Floyd situation as something that was embarrassing for America. But, you know, something like that happens every day in every African citizen, in every African country, every African city. The fact that the abuser is Black doesn't make it any more acceptable for the victim. So, you know, it's really important. And again, just to really reiterate Chuma's points, and I have really enjoyed listening to Chuma, it's to realize that we all have the power in our hands to contribute to building a fair justice system that serves the interests of absolutely everybody.
Thank you very much, Rakia. Sahra?
I just want to say in conclusion, you know, listening to Rakia and Chuma always has the ability to make you feel like you can actually make a difference and that you should be doing so much more than you're doing. And every time I listen to either of them, particularly with justice and security, I always go away feeling hopeful and sort of, you know, feeling, you know, like you can do so much and, you know, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I think if they made, you know, if more people and a lot more people felt like that and acted upon it and followed up on it, I think we might be closer to having a fairer access to justice for so many more of our people. And I think it's absolutely true. Privileged people like us in Somaliland only notice things are absent when we need them. I spent a lot of years in the Somaliland court trying to get a particular case through, and it was then that I noticed all the problems and all the constraints for somebody like me who's very privileged, who had the wealth, who had the connection, who knew people. And it was so that there is no way a normal regular person could be able to, or should be expected to, or would be able to navigate all those things. So I think we all should do better, and we all must do better for our justice sector. And thank you so much for allowing me to participate and also, you know, have the opportunity to listen to Chuma and Rakia. I'm very, very grateful, and I apologize on behalf of my kids as well. Thank you for having me.
Having the kids was lovely.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Chama.
Well, I don't want to add anything also because I see the time is there, and Mustafa and Tirsi will kill me if I continue speaking now, since the time is over. I just want to really to thank our speakers, the wonderful we were expecting, and you delivered it, and so it was really educational. So I really want to thank the team. If there is a takeaway, before I take my takeaway, I want also to thank Sarah for, despite the current situation, she delivered it. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. If we did learn anything from coronavirus, is that we should count on what we have in our hands, whether it's food security or elsewhere. This session showed us that we didn't need before anything outside in order to do the justice in our societies. We will not need in the future outside support in order to have the justice in our society. What we need, what we require, as what Chuma and Rake was saying, is a responsibility. So I think this shows us for my takeaway on this discussion. The other thing I want to highlight is the access to the information. Show it one more time. It's among the basic human rights. And I'm really thankful to Rakia underlining that issue about the Radio Hargeysa, but also in general to have plurality of the media, and not only to have information, but have the right information, and mostly fight the misinformation that was taking place in many places in Africa, and in particular in Somaliland, where at some point we didn't even believe that the coronavirus was for us, but was for someone else. So I'm really thankful for having these two major points as a takeaway from. I know that the next session will be related. It's a sort of a continuation of what we have done, because we will be focusing on security and what was the impact of the coronavirus on security. I want really to thank Hannah, what you have done. Brilliant job. Thank you so much for moderating as such. And I just want to ask Tirsi if she can anticipate us any names or anyone who will be having in the next session on security.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jama, and I will mention names, but I once again want to say thank you very much for everyone, Zahara, for taking the responsibility with all such things in your hands, Vagia for all the informative message, of course, Hannah for an amazing thing, and I will excuse Chuma, who just have to leave us before we close, but a very good contribution that he has done. So in terms of anticipating who we might have in our next session, which is, as Dr. Jama mentioned, gonna be focusing on peace and security in the region and also in the continent. We're expecting guests from the security institutions in the continent. And also we have mainly female panelists who are going to be enlightening us with a powerful message in terms of security and how this has been a challenge, and also what has been a way into handling these things during this pandemic. So thank you very much, everyone who is following us on the social medias and then in this platform. And see you next week, and wait for me on Twitter to announce who is coming and how it's going to be. Have a good night. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Thanks very much.
Thank you.